The Marine grabbed her wrist at the bar, and the room went still. Not the kind of still where everyone stops talking because something interesting is happening. The kind of still where everybody who has been around trouble long enough recognizes that the next 30 seconds are going to determine how the rest of the night goes for a number of people, and none of them want to be in the count. I was behind the stick at Caldera's, what everyone called the bar at the bottom of the hill in Portavel, a port city that doesn't appear in the travel guides for reasons that become self-evident about 40 minutes after you arrive. I had been tending bar there for 11 years, first as a second job after I got out of the Corps, and then as the main job when the knee gave out. The clientele was military adjacent, not always active duty, not always on the record, occasionally in transit between places they weren't supposed to be going. I had learned to read a room the way bartenders at border towns learn to read a room, early, accurately, and without letting on. I had been watching her for an hour before the Marine found her. She had come in at 21:30, alone, carrying nothing but a small bag that she set on the floor between her feet rather than on the bar where anyone walking past could open it. She wore civilian clothes, a gray jacket, dark trousers, boots with a low heel, and she sat with her back to the wall at the far end of the bar. Not the stool that offers the best sightlines in the room. The best sightlines in the room. She ordered a glass of water with ice, which is what people order when they want to hold a glass and look like they're drinking without impeding their reaction time. I had seen people use that order before, not many. She was not there to drink. She was there to observe something or wait for something, and in 11 years behind that bar, I had developed the particular patience of a man who has learned to let those situations resolve themselves. She was not causing trouble and she was not drawing attention, which in Portavel is its own kind of skill. I refilled her water glass twice in that first hour without being asked. Both times she gave me a single nod of acknowledgement and nothing else. She was watching the room the way a person watches a room when the room is part of their work. The Marines came in at 22:15, a group of 4, off a ship that had docked that afternoon at the Eastern Pier. Not in uniform, but the haircuts and the way they moved through a doorway shoulders wide, reading the room before they entered, noting the exits without appearing to note them, announced them to anyone paying attention. They were not causing trouble either at first. They ordered rounds, found a table by the far wall, got progressively louder in the way of men on shore leave who have been at sea for several weeks, and are rediscovering that they have volume and space, and no watch rotation in 3 hours. I had no issue with them. Caldera's regulars were harder to manage than 4 Marines on liberty. I kept an eye on them the way I kept an eye on all of them, which was without appearing to, and I kept a second eye on her at the end of the bar, which was also without appearing to, and in this way I tracked both at once and did not think anything was going to connect the two. At 22:40, one of them came to the bar for a fresh round and noticed her. His name was, I found out later it was Corporal Davin Orr, and I will use his name because names matter, and because he is part of the record of what happened in Caldera's that night, and the record should be accurate. Orr was 23 years old and built in the way of men who spend their 20s making their bodies into the maximum version of themselves, and he was 3 drinks into the kind of confidence that 3 drinks produce when the baseline is already high. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down on the stool next to hers, uninvited, and said something to her that I didn't fully catch. She looked at him. She said something brief. Her expression did not change. He said something else, still brief from his expression, but the tone had shifted. She looked at him the way someone looks at a thing they've already catalogued and moved past, and she looked at her water glass. He reached across and put his hand around her wrist. He did it with the kind of casual ownership that men sometimes deploy toward women in bars when they have decided that proximity justifies liberty. Not a violent grip, but a claim, the specific claim of a man who expects the person he's claiming to manage herself around his decision. That was when the room went still. Calderas had seen a lot of still moments. There was a particular quality to this one. 4 other men at the bar along the near side had each, in the prior minute, made the unconscious adjustments that people make when they sense something developing: shoulders angling slightly inward, drinks coming up, eyes going indirect. Not watching. Not watching. Waiting to know whether to watch. She did not pull away. She did not raise her voice. She did not flinch or look at his hand or shift in her seat. She looked at his face and she said something to him that I could not hear from where I was standing, but I am a man who has watched faces in low light for 11 years, and I can describe what I saw in Orr's face in the 3 seconds after she spoke. First, humor. The default of a man who believes he's having a conversation on his terms and finds the other person interesting. Second, a particular blankness that comes when something you've heard doesn't arrive in the pattern you expected, and your processing has paused to figure out what category to put it in. Third, a question forming, not the question of challenge, the question of someone who has just realized they might not know the shape of what they're in. She said it again, still quiet, still looking at his face. Her free hand was flat on the bar surface, fingers relaxed and spread, not ready for anything, settled, as though she had already decided what the outcome was going to be and was simply being patient while Orr caught up. Orr let go of her wrist. He did it in the way that people put something down when they've been informed that it belongs to someone else and they're still working out the implications. Not fast, careful. He went back to his table. He sat down. His 3 friends had been watching and I could see them asking him something. He shook his head, more deliberately than once, and picked up his drink. He said nothing more about her for the rest of the night. I watched this happen, and then I went back to wiping the bar, which is what bartenders do when they are processing something they have just watched and do not yet fully understand. The other men along the bar near side went back to their drinks in the same motion, collectively and without coordination, the way a room settles back after a storm warning comes on the radio and then the announcer says it's been downgraded. She stayed at her stool. She picked up her water glass. Her hand was steady around it. She did not look at the table of Marines. She did not look satisfied or relieved or any variation of either. She did not look at Orr's back as he walked away. She looked the way she had looked since she walked in at 21:30, attentive and settled, and continuing whatever she had been doing as if the last 5 minutes had been a weather event that had simply passed. I thought, she has handled something like this before. Then I thought, she has handled things considerably worse than this, and she knows it, and that is the whole of why none of what just happened showed on her face. About 20 minutes later, a local man drifted to the bar and sat 2 stools down from her. He ordered in Port Portuguese, waited a few minutes, and said something toward her in the low register that port bars use for certain proposals. She said 3 or 4 words back without looking at him. He looked at his glass, set down his money, and left without finishing his drink. The whole exchange lasted 90 seconds. Nobody registered it. I refilled her water glass. She nodded once. At 23:10, a man came through the side entrance. He was unremarkable in the specific way that certain professionals are unremarkable. Medium height, civilian clothes that fit well without being notable, dark hair, the kind of face that you would not be able to describe accurately if someone asked you 10 minutes later. He sat down at the far end of the bar, 3 stools from her. He ordered a beer in accented Portuguese and paid immediately, and set his hands flat on the bar while he waited. He did not look at her. She did not look at him. They sat at opposite ends of the bar for 6 minutes, not looking at each other, and the conversation they were not having was the most careful thing I had watched all night. At the 6-minute mark, she reached into the small bag at her feet and removed something flat, perhaps a document, perhaps a small sealed packet, and set it on the bar surface near her elbow. She slid it to her left in a motion that was part of a larger casual gesture, as though she were simply adjusting where her hand rested. The man at the far end reached out with his right hand in a motion that was also casual, and the thing she had placed was no longer there. He finished his beer. He left through the side entrance. She looked at nothing in particular. I wiped the bar. I thought about whether I had seen what I thought I had seen. I decided I had. She finished her water. She left through the front. I thought about that for a while. At 30, Corporal Orr was at the bar again, getting one more round before they headed back to the ship. He had been quieter after the wrist incident, not subdued exactly, but with the particular quietness of a man carrying a question he hasn't resolved. He put his elbows on the bar and waited. When I set his glasses down, he did not reach for them immediately. He looked at the stool where she had been sitting. He said, "That woman who was sitting there earlier, what do you know about her?" I said I didn't know anything about her, which was true or had been. He said, "She told me something. I didn't understand it." I said, "What did she tell you?" He thought about it. "She said my unit had better hope she wasn't here for them." He paused. "She said it like she was telling me what time it was." I didn't say anything to that. He said, "You ever see her before?" I said I hadn't. He sat there for a moment. "She gave me a choice," he said. "She could have made it much worse and she didn't." He set the glass down. "I think I need to tell my co something in the morning." I poured him his round and he took it back to the table, and I thought about what I had watched. The water glass and the careful seat and the transfer at 23:10 and the 6 minutes of practice non-acknowledgement between two professionals who were very much acknowledging each other. I did not know her name, and I did not know her call sign, and I did not know what she was doing in Portugal that night, or what she had handed across the bar at 23:10, or to whom. I found out her call sign 6 days later, when a man I recognized as someone who came through Calderas twice a year en routes I didn't ask about sat down at the same stool she had occupied and ordered a water with ice. Not a beer, a water with ice. I noticed the order. He asked me what I had observed the night of the 22nd. He had the specific stillness of someone who already knows most of what you're going to tell them and is interested in the margins, the details you might have noticed that didn't appear in any report. I told him what I had seen. I told him about the bag on the floor and the seating choice and the water glass and the 4 Marines and Orr's hand on her wrist, and the 2 quiet sentences, and the 6 minutes, and the transfer and the side entrance, and the way she had finished her water and left. He listened without taking notes. His expression did not change during any of it. When I was done, he was quiet for a moment, which I had learned in 11 years to recognize as something different from having nothing to say. He said, "The woman you're describing, her call sign is Quicksilver." He said it the way you say a title that explains something. He told me only that the operation she was running had been in place for 7 weeks, and that nothing Orr had done had compromised it, and that she had managed the situation precisely as trained. He used the word precisely, which I thought was interesting, because what I had observed did not look like technique in the moment. It had looked like someone responding to a situation from something deeper than technique, the automatic competence of a person who has been operating in rooms like this long enough that the responses are not decisions anymore. They are simply what happens. He also told me one other thing, which I will write down because it is the piece of that night that has settled heaviest in my thinking. He said that Quicksilver had been operating in the Portable area and surrounding port cities for 7 weeks. She had run 3 prior exchanges in 4 different locations. The number of locations exceeding the number of exchanges meant she had moved her working ground to avoid pattern, and in all 3 prior instances, there had been a friction event of some kind. A local contact who had pushed past his role, a surveillance element that had gotten too close. A third situation he described only as a complication that could have unraveled 2 months of positioning, if handled incorrectly. I said, "What kind of complication?" He described a man who had recognized her from a previous operational area, different city, different cover, who began asking questions that were not curious questions but probing ones. She acknowledged the recognition without acknowledging the identity, gave him a version of a prior meeting that fit her current cover, and gave him enough attention that he felt he had resolved his confusion rather than confirmed it. She did it in the middle of a working dinner with 4 other people at the table, and none of them registered the exchange happened. I thought about that for a while. 7 weeks, rotating locations, a different friction event each time, never breaking the surface, never losing a day. In each case, she had resolved the event without breaking cover, without escalating into anything that attracted outside attention, and without interrupting the operational timeline by a single day. He said that the night of the 22nd, with Orr's hand on her wrist in front of a room full of people who were watching without appearing to watch, was the clearest version of that pattern. A man had decided she was a target, had, in his own framework, done nothing worse than what hundreds of men on shore leave do in bars in port cities around the world, and she had neutralized the decision with one quiet sentence, twice, without raising a hand or her voice or anything that would have drawn attention from the surrounding room, and he had returned to his table, and she had continued her work, and the exchange at 23:10 had proceeded on schedule without incident. I said, what did she say to him when she told him to let go? He considered the question. She told him her call sign and her classification level, he said. She told him that if he continued, she would be required to bring him up on charges that would end his career, and that the charges would be accurate. And then she told him that none of that would be her preference, and that her preference was to let him go back to his table and finish his leave without incident. He paused. She gave him the choice. She trusted him to make the right one. I sat with that for a while. I thought about what it takes to be that calm with a man's hand on your wrist in a bar in a port city, with a room watching and an operation running, to calculate the geometry of it that quickly and speak the exact 2 sentences that neutralize the situation without drawing a single eye from the rest of the room. That is years of work becoming instinct. He did, I said. He did, the man said. He finished his water. He stood up and set a bill on the bar that covered the water and more, and did not draw attention to the fact that it covered more, which is also a skill. Then he went to the side entrance, and I heard the door close behind him. I have tended bar in Portavel for 11 years. I have seen men and women in transit between assignments that don't have names in any official document, moving through the space of a bar at the end of the world like ordinary people. Most of them I forget because they give me nothing to remember. Occasionally one of them gives me something that stays. She gave me this, the room going still when his hand closed on her wrist, and then her voice quiet and level and twice, and then the room moving again, and her hand flat on the bar, and everything she had come to do that night continuing without interruption. Quicksilver. She had been doing this work for 7 weeks and would go on doing it for however long it required, in whatever bar in whatever port city the operation needed, and no man's mistake was going to alter that timeline. That is what the call sign meant, I think, not speed exactly. More like the quality of mercury, which flows around whatever impedes it and loses none of itself in the passage. Corporal Orr put in a report to his co the next morning. I heard this from the man with the water glass who mentioned it as a matter of fact, without judgment in either direction. The co had passed the report up a chain that intersected with the chain Quicksilver operated in, and whatever came back down that chain, it satisfied the relevant parties that no harm had been done and no cover had been broken, or was spoken to. I do not know more specifically than that. The man with the water glass said that Orr's account matched exactly what her operation file showed she was authorized to say. He had understood it correctly. He had made the right call. What I know is that 6 nights after the 22nd, I looked at the stool at the far end of the bar and thought about a woman who had sat there for 2 hours doing something important and invisible, who had been grabbed by a stranger and had said 2 quiet sentences and gotten her wrist back, and who had then continued doing the important and invisible thing as though the interruption were nothing worth noting. The bar in Portavel has seen a lot of things. That is the one I still think about.